Thank you for starting the recording, and we can jump in. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Mitigation Working Group of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. I'm Mark Stewart, Climate Change Program Manager. It's Spirit Day here at MDE, so I'm feeling especially jazzed to be your facilitator today. Note that we're recording the meeting, so be mindful of your cameras and microphones. Are there any MWG or Climate Commission members joining by phone, or is there anyone here who's standing in for a member today?
This is Jennifer Laszlo, Mizrahi, calling in.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. All righty.
And I'm here on behalf of Nate Holtman.
That's right. You beat me to it. So yeah, I'll jump to that announcement. Professor Nate Holtman is a member of the MWG. He is on a wonderful assignment with working with John Kerry for the next few months. Kathleen Kennedy, who many of you have seen before, because she led the modeling team that MDE partnered with for the development of the Pathway Report and our climate plan. So she's back and standing in for Nate while he's on assignment. So Dr. Kennedy is an assistant research professor at the Center for Global Sustainability at University of Maryland's School of Public Policy. And thank you very much, Kathleen, for joining us today. All righty. Note to the participants who aren't members, we're going to keep some time for public comments right after the co-chair's opening remarks. So we'll turn to you early in today's meeting. And with that, let me turn it over to the co-chairs, Kim Coble and Mike Powell.
Thank you, Mark. Welcome, everybody, and I really do appreciate your time. I think this is an important meeting. We're going to start assessing and voting on our recommendations to the commission in order to what should go into the final report that the commission submits for 2024. So lots to discuss. And I will say, over the years of working with this commission, I continue to be really pleased with how much how credible our report is and how much it matters to legislators and to the governor's office. So if you're feeling fatigued, don't. Your work is making a difference, and I really appreciate it.
I'll second Kim's comments. I would add that unlike some prior years, we actually have a reasonable number of proposals to evaluate. So we can accommodate perhaps a little more discussion, though a number of them are recommendations that were made in prior years. So we'll try to, if we can, move quickly through those, but obviously it's whatever discussion people need to have, we need to have.
Great, thank you for that. And for those of you who are on our email distribution list, you would have received last week an email including the draft recommendations that are up for discussion today. I will, through the course of this meeting, put them up on the screen so that if you haven't seen them already, or even if you have, we'll all be able to look at them together as we discuss them. But oh, got it. Okay, no problem, Leslie. But we do want to start with some public comments to give people the opportunity to share any thoughts about the draft recommendations or other topics that are germane to the MWG. Before the MWG members spend really the rest of today's meeting discussing the draft recommendations, I think that based on a meeting that I had with the co-chairs a week or so ago, if there seemed to be consensus agreement on some of the recommendations, the body here could decide to bring some things to a vote. Otherwise, we intend for today to be an opportunity to discuss the draft recommendations, suggest edits to them, and then look ahead to the September 18th meeting of the MWG to finalize your recommendations for this year, which would then be forwarded to the Climate Commission for its consideration to include in this year's annual report. So with that, I'm happy to turn things to public comment. If anyone who's not a Climate Commission member or MWG member would like to make any comments at this point. I see a hand up from Donald Goldberg, so go ahead, Donald.
Good afternoon, everybody. I guess this is as good a time as any to bring to your attention that my organization, Climate Law and Policy Project, known as CLPP, has done a set of papers. We're actually in the midst of writing a group of papers on cap and invest. So since that's recommendation one, it seems like it would be timely to bring those to your attention. We wrote a primer which lays out all what we thought were the key issues with cap and invest. And now we're going through each issue individually and writing an issue brief. So we've got two briefs done so far. One is on trajectories. That's the overarching cap, if you will. The second brief discusses review of the program and something we refer to as automatic adjustments. Most cap and invest programs have some features that automatically adjust the budget or possibly other elements if things are getting a little off track. That's the topic of the second brief. I'd like to say a very quick word about it because there's a very important issue that comes up that we discussed in the second brief. Those of you who were here when Dallas Bertraw talked about cap and invest, he mentioned something called the waterbed effect. What that is, if you don't recall, when the state invests, as cap and invest implies they will do, they're investing to achieve reductions, maybe to invest in infrastructure that makes reductions possible, or maybe in projects themselves that actually are intended to achieve reductions. The waterbed effect tells us that it's in the name of an aspect of cap and invest because you have allowances. When you do that kind of investment, if you actually achieve reductions, you're not necessarily reducing emissions in the state because those allowances are still on the system and they'll be used. So the second brief talks about ways of dealing with the waterbed effect. So when the government makes investments, we can be sure that those are achieving real reductions. That's all I need to say. I'm going to put the links to the three papers we've written so far in the chat, if I can figure out how to do that. Okay, thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Donald. And if you can't put it in the chat, then feel free to email it to me and I can help out.
Okay, I think I can do it.
So I see one other person with their hand up for public comment. So go to Kyle.
Thanks, Mark. Kyle Gillian. I'm here wearing two hats. I'm a new resident of Maryland, having moved to Annapolis in September of last year. But I also am the Global Vice President for Government Relations for Carrier Corp. For those not familiar, Carrier is a global leader in air conditioning, heating, and refrigeration equipment and services. And Willis Carrier actually invented the modern day air conditioner. So I'm happy to be here this afternoon. I wanted to just provide some brief comments around the draft recommendations. As we reviewed the recommendations, we're fully supportive of the funding mechanisms and approaches that were outlined in the draft document. We're largely supportive of those because the state under Governor Moore's leadership has some ambitious electrification goals, which change out fossil fuel burning furnaces for heat pumps. And the market reality of that technology transition is that that causes more cost to the consumer. And so when you're looking at low to middle income consumers and households, that's an additional burden on them on the financial side to change over. And so the funding mechanisms that would find their way into incentives for those particular consumers, low to medium income, would be helpful in facilitating the work of the state in meeting its climate and electrification heat pump installation goals. We do have a concern with one of the recommendations, though, and that's the recommendation that would require a small independent business owner, which in this case would be an HVAC contractor, to get an affidavit from a consumer and then filing that affidavit with the state. We're not quite sure how that process would actually work. And again, when you talk about someone that comes to your home and sits down at your kitchen table to make a recommendation and changing out your equipment, the simpler that process is, the better. And we feel like that affidavit requirement would severely kind of complicate that discussion at the kitchen table by that small business owner talking directly with their consumer. We would be more than happy to talk through the reason why that recommendation was made, explore other alternatives, but at this point, the way it's currently drafted, we do have a concern with that particular recommendation. But again, very supportive on the funding side and more than willing to sit down and be a constructive voice in the development of any recommendations moving forward. So please let us know if we can be helpful in that regard.
Great, thank you very much, Kyle. And going to Rob Sargent. Hi, Rob.
Hi, Mark. Hi, everybody. My name is Rob Sargent. I'm policy director for a small organization called Cultura that focuses on gasoline, data-driven programs to maximize both gasoline use and reduction as a metric for transportation greenhouse gas programs, but then also promoting policies that would steer the way that applies here is that we're promoting policies that would steer EV deployment to a greater extent towards people who use more gasoline. The beauty of this approach, which we were excited to see in the last version of the climate plan. Sorry, I have a dog yipping. Is that it can help supercharge existing programs to maximize both the environmental and economic benefits of EV deployment. But even more importantly, it creates huge equity opportunities because if you target low-income folks who are using more gasoline, they're going to see a greater improvement in their quality of life. So trying to steer programs to that. So I just wanted to sort of, one, thank you all for including the pilot program in the most recent version of the plan, but then also to suggest that at a time of tight budgets that having a data-driven approach that maximizes emission reductions, economic benefits, and equity is something that could potentially appeal to a broad array of audiences. We're seeing bipartisan support for this in California. If you're going to spend thousands of dollars getting somebody behind the wheel of an EV, let's maximize the results. And in this case, there's, as I said, there's a huge equity benefit. So I'd love to continue that conversation. There was a bill on incentives last year that Delegate Fraser Hidalgo offered that originally included language to encourage at least outreach to low-income, high fuel-consuming drivers. But we think it's a good approach, and it's beginning to get some attention thanks to folks like MDE and others who have been, including it in plans. So anyway, that's all I've got to say, but I'd love to continue that conversation. I think there's any number of places that the approach could take hold. And just so you know, I did send you a little fact sheet that sort of describes this. I included that in the chat. So
Great. Thanks, Rob. I appreciate that. All right. Well, I think that concludes the public comments. Thank you for those who participated in that. And at this point, we want to open a discussion on the draft recommendations. I will pull them up. The first ones on the list came in from Kim Coble. So Kim, as I'm pulling them up, I'll ask you to introduce them so that everyone's familiar with them.
Kim, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. And the first recommendation is a package of 3 proposals that I'm suggesting go in as a whole. And they are to generate revenue for the state to use to combat climate change and climate change impacts. The basis of this is the document that we're all very familiar with, which was the Pollution Reduction Plan, and the estimate that it was going to be $1 billion a year for us to meet our goals. So in order to do that, we have to generate more revenue. And that's the intent of this recommendation, is to enable the state to generate more revenue specific for climate programs. And the 3 parts of this recommendation are first, to include an authorization for MDE to expand the already existing Cap and Invest program that they have through RGGI. And just to refresh everybody, the RGGI program's been very successful in raising revenue this year, $241 million, and I think over $1 billion in the last decade or so. So what the RGGI program is specifically targeted at fossil fuel power plants. And if we expand the Cap and Invest program by asking MDE to develop the program, that we could generate more revenue. And I don't know the estimate of that exactly, but there are other states that have done this and have generated hundreds of millions of dollars that they are using for climate impact. The recommendation that I put forward divides the allocation of those funds into 6 different areas. One is 20% of it to go to home energy efficiency and electrification, providing up to $14,000 for households, low, moderate, and middle income households. And the other one is 20% of it would go to providing $7,500 per household to low, moderate, and middle income to transition to EVs or purchase an EV vehicle. 20% of the funds would go to commercial, multifamily, and institutional buildings. We are very familiar with the need to electrify buildings, and we would provide grants and subsidized loans for energy efficiency and electrification projects in those buildings. 20% of it would go to infrastructure, subsidizing loans and projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions from industry, landfills, wastewater treatment plants, construction, and include EV charging stations and transit lines and bike lanes. 15% would go to the natural and working lands, which is helping adaptation and some mitigation as well. And then 5% would go to program administration. Yeah, maybe I'll just keep going through it all and then we can go to it. The second part of the revenue package is to once again endorse a fossil fuel transport fee and mitigation fund. This was a bill that Delegate Stein had put in last year. And he's on the phone. I'll go ahead and introduce it and then offer him to say anything that I've missed here. But this year, the bill would be similar, where there is a fee that is put on the transport of coal and the transport of natural gas as two fossil fuels that are transported through Maryland. And the fee would then go to create a mitigation fund, a climate mitigation fund. The mitigation fund, the distribution of the fund would go as follows: 25% of it for energy efficiency and electrification, similar to what was discussed in CAP and events, 25% to commercial, multifamily, and institutional buildings, 23% to EV incentives and charging equipment, as well as electric school buses, 20% to mass transit, and then 2% would go to treating the asthma in the communities that are affected by the coal dust transported through the communities there, and 5% for program administration. I do want to point out that the estimates that was created for the bill last year indicate that an average Maryland household that still uses natural gas would see a monthly bill impact of about $2, assuming the gas companies transferred all of the expenses to the consumer. And the bill would generate about $300 million a year. Delegate Stein has added a new provision this year, which is to enable the Maryland Clean Energy Center to use the funds and leverage a portion of them for low interest bonds, which would then give us more capacity over more years for revenue. And then the last one is to authorize the RENEW Act. This was a bill that was put in last year, responding to emergency needs from extreme weather Act, so the RENEW Act. And this is modeled after a bill that Vermont had put in and passed that looks at the largest international fossil fuel companies and they would pay a one-time fee for their historical emissions. So it's retrospective in nature. And it's thought will generate about $1 billion as a one-time fee. So we're recommending that this package of 3 different revenue sources go in as a whole to a recommendation in the final report. And before I turn the mic back to Mark, Delegate Stein, is there anything that I missed that you want to add to the transport fee?
No, thanks. Very good summary. Thanks, Kim. And as you noted, my presentation to the mitigation working group, I'd suggested that, based on conversations with the Clean Energy Center, that a certain amount of the annual revenue that's generated be leveraged for a significant bond. Could be $1 billion. It could be higher than that. So I do think that would be a very good way to allocate some of the money that's generated. Also, just want to suggest that public education about the incentives that are available through the IRA, especially, or will be available through the IRA, is important. So I would suggest a small amount, perhaps 1%, be allocated to a public information campaign to let provide that information to homeowners, nonprofits, businesses about about those opportunities, because it's important that Marylanders, take advantage of those as much as possible.
Right. And so that package is, I guess, one recommendation for the commission to consider. So, Mark, do you want me to go through the others, or should we tackle that one first?
My hunch is that we might generate discussion on one A, B, and C without needing to go through the others yet. We are fortunate to have, as I mentioned earlier, Kathleen Kennedy with us, and Kathleen's team led the modeling, which is implicated here in this recommendation, that led to the climate pathway report and that informed Maryland's climate pollution reduction plan. So as a brief recap of what, from a modeling perspective, how Cap and Invest fits in, Kathleen offered to give a really quick review of some information that she presented mostly to the MWG about a year ago. But we thought this might be a handy recap. So Kathleen, do you want me to pull your slides up?
I think I can share them. Let me see here. Okay. Yeah, so as Mark said, I'm going to just try to do a very quick recap of some of our modeling results, specifically with a focus on how the Cap and Invest was represented in our modeling. So I'll give a brief overview of the modeling results, which policies were included, and then the specific contribution from the Cap and Invest. So this is just really big picture reminder of how we approached this modeling. We included state and federal policies modeled through 2050 for two different scenarios. First is just the current policies on the books in Maryland and at the federal level. And then the second is current plus planned policies that are proposed in the state's climate pollution reduction plan. And we did this through linking multiple models. So on the emissions side, our primary model was GChem USA. And so that's where we modeled the emissions cap in this process. And then we linked that to some models on the impact side, looking at health impacts from air quality and the economic impacts through analysis by the team at Towson. And so that's where the investment side of the Cap and Invest was modeled in the REMI model with Towson. So this is not including the investment as a potential source of additional reductions beyond what the cap itself provides. This is modeled as offsetting the cost of compliance in strategic sectors identified by MDE, very similar to what's in the recommendation here. So these are the overall results. We found that the current policy scenario achieved 50% reductions by 2031, which does, of course, fall short of the state's goal. But with the cap included, the current plus planned policy scenario does reach the 60% gross emissions reduction goal in 2031 and net zero in 2045. So also important to note that for the net zero goal, there is also a need to incentivize negative emissions, such as you see here on the right. But for 2031, just baseline numbers to keep in mind, the total reductions needed from 2006 levels is 73.3 megatons. State's already achieved 36.7 megatons reduction as of 2020. We found that full implementation of current policies can deliver another 26 megatons of reduction. And so that leaves a 10.6 megaton gap that needs to be filled by these additional proposed policies. So here's a quick review of what was included in the current policies. I think all of you have seen this before, so I'm not going to go through it in detail, but just a reminder, we do have all these very specific sectoral policies included, such as BEPS, ACC2, etc. For the additional planned policies, we include all of the current policies as well, but we layer on top some more ambitious versions of, for instance, the RGGI cap, the Clean Electricity Standard of 100% by 2035, and so on. And we have the Cap and Invest as a backstop policy to achieve the remaining reductions needed to reach the 2031 goal. So this is specifically how we modeled the Cap and Invest and what it contributes. It is roughly modeled after the Washington State program. So the things that are included are road transportation emissions, commercial and residential buildings, industrial fuel use, and the cement sector. We did exclude electricity sector here because we determined with MDE that it was already covered by the cap and invest through RGGI, and so we didn't need to double count those reductions there. We also excluded agriculture and forestry and land use, as well as the fossil fuel industry, industrial process emissions, waste management, and then specifically aviation, rail, shipping, and non-road diesel from the transportation sector. So these were partly determined to be sectors that were more sensitive and perhaps couldn't bear the cost of compliance as well, or sectors that were more difficult to model within our tools. So the primary activities that were affected by the cap were the industrial sector and road transportation. So that's where the majority of the emissions reductions come from, although it does affect all sectors that are included. And we find that this contributes around 3.5, specifically 3.48 megatons to the 2031 goal and 15.56 megatons to the 2045 net zero goal. So a couple of thoughts on interpretation of these results. First, just want to say that the cap and invest first indicates the sectors that would be the cheapest place to further reduce emissions beyond the proposed policies, and indicates the magnitude of reductions needed. The reductions could be achieved by a variety of approaches, cap and invest being one of them, of course, but I wouldn't want to interpret these modeling results as saying that is the only way to reach the goal. And also important to remember, again, for the 2045 net zero goal, that the cap and invest in our modeling provides an incentive to deploy carbon dioxide removal, which is not relevant for the 2031 gross goal, but may be something to consider for longer term. With that, happy to answer any clarifying questions, or I'll turn it back over to Mark.
Thanks, Kathleen. Looks like we have a few hands up. So whether these are clarifying for Kathleen or just part of discussion on recommendation 1A, let's dive in. Let's see, Mark, you beat Mike by a microsecond, so you've got the floor.
Great, thanks, Mark. Could we put back up the slide deck, because I just want to go back to the next to last slide and ask a question about that. And then I do have a couple comments about the cap and invest policy, but I just want to start with, I'm sorry, the one ahead, please. Thank you. Question about the first bullet, cap and invest impacts indicate the sectors where it will be cheapest to further reduce emissions and magnitude of emissions needed, or reductions needed. Could you elaborate on what those sectors are, and was that, were those determinations made after excluding the sectors listed on the previous slides that would be excluded from the cap and invest program?
Correct. So the excluded sectors were left out from the beginning, and then the model decides between the sectors that are included where to reduce emissions and by how much. And so those were primarily the industrial sector and road transport, as I said here. But that's not, again, prescriptive, saying that's the only way it could happen, but that's the indication from the model that it estimates that's the cheapest way to do it.
Okay. Could the model be rerun by re-including some of the sectors that were excluded from the beginning?
Some of them, yes. As I said, some of these were choices about what might be best to include or exclude, and some were based on difficulties with the modeling. So, for instance, non-CO2 emissions were primarily modeled outside of GCAM. And so it's harder to include them in the cap because those emissions aren't available to the model to decrease. So it depends on which ones you'd want to add back in.
Okay. Thanks. And Mark, my second question concerns the cap and invest policy proposal. So I could ask that now, or I could wait in case you want to finish with the modeling.
Well, let's see, Mike or Tom, you've got your hands up. Do you have any clarifying questions for Kathleen before we turn to the recommendation?
Yeah, I saw estimates, at least based upon the Washington, that the proposal would add about 25 cents to 32 cents price to a gallon of gasoline. has their number been run for what the estimate would be in Maryland?
So we did include changes in fuel costs. Again, going back here, that's part of what fed into Remy's economic impact modeling. But, you know, that's again something where the real world might change depending on exactly how the policy is implemented. So those are very, you know, take it with a grain of salt numbers.
Well, is it in that range, or is it, or you can't tell, or?
I honestly can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, so I'd have to check back. Yeah.
I think RFF's paper, which is a little bit more recent than CGS's modeling, included like a hypothetical. They were maybe using the RGGI carbon price for some anticipated effects on the economy. I think I maybe saw that Dallas or others from RFF are here, so I don't know if they want to chime in terms of the carbon pricing that they used for their analysis.
Hi, this is Dallas. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks so much for joining.
Hi. I don't have it open in front of me right now, the carbon price we used the carbon intensity of gasoline to map from what a change in the carbon price would be to a change in the retail price of gasoline. And we looked at household expenditures across different types of fuel. But and we looked at a possibility to compensate low-income households. But the carbon price we used, we imagined was scalable to what was necessary to achieve the carbon reduction goal. So I don't have any more information to say about what the actual price would be. I have to look at the report to see if we took it further than that, but I didn't have it in my mind this morning.
What was the 25 cent to 32 cents what they're seeing in Washington, or do you know that?
Well, the general prescription is that for say a 25 cent, $25 per ton of carbon translates into roughly 20 or 22 cents per gallon. So that's the relationship. And Washington State is currently around $25 a ton. So that would be what would apply in Washington to retail price of gasoline in Washington. And that formula would carry forward to Maryland. So if Maryland was, the market was equilibrating at $25 a ton, I would expect to see a 22 cent per change per gallon of gasoline.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thanks.
Tom?
Thanks. Question for Kathleen on how the model treats electricity generation in state. Because when I read the narrative that goes along with the pathway modeling, it says that natural gas generation falls by over 95% from today's levels, and it attributes that to the Cap and Invest program. And I thought I heard you say that electricity sector wasn't included. So I'm wondering if you can help me understand how it was treated and what we can attribute to the anticipated reduction in natural gas emissions from generation in state.
Yeah, so one important distinction here, the pathway report was an earlier version of the modeling. What I'm presenting here is the modeling that supported the state's climate plan. So the scenarios were a little bit different. So just keep that in mind as you're looking at things. But yes, so the electricity sector was not included in the Cap and Invest, but it was included in RGGI, which is itself a Cap and Invest, of course. And there was the clean electricity standard that's been proposed for 100% clean power by 2035. So between the RGGI cap, which we also modeled as more ambitiously going to zero emissions by 2035, and that clean electricity standard, that's really what's driving most of the changes in the power sector. So those are the two policies that are contributing to the gas changes. Yeah.
So RGGI was modeled at an anticipated faster reduction through that program, not its current.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if I can, just a clarifying question from Kim. are you proposing that this be a authorization for Maryland to enter and expand inside of Reggie, or to stand up a commodities trading or cap and trade program like Washington State? You're still muted. It's okay.
Sorry. Not clear. To do it similar to Washington State.
Okay. That's all I've got for now. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Tom. Garrett.
Thanks, Mark. And thanks for all these proposals. My comment is that I'm generally supportive of all of the three different revenue concepts here, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive, and I think it's smart and necessary to pursue each of them. I think their chances of success, even if bills were to move on all three, are still all in question. And it's important that we don't just pick one thing to try to do, because it's very critical that we solve for some revenue here. My question about, or I guess my comment / question about this one on the cap and invest in particular, I don't find the argument convincing yet that we should be excluding the sectors that have been excluded and not excluding the ones that are included. I see other policy moves throughout the menu of existing and planned, assumed new policies that touch all of the things that are both excluded and not excluded. And I would want to understand that better. So I guess my question is it necessary for us at this stage to agree on exactly what sectors would be excluded from this thing for the purpose of enabling it to be designed? I would be very comfortable with a recommendation that says we got to do something like cap and invest. We absolutely should have a bill that says let's move forward with this, go figure it out. Can we do that while still being open to exactly what sectors should be included in exactly what ways? I feel like that's something that needs to be thought about very carefully, and it doesn't feel to me like we've done all of that thinking at this stage to have a rigid approach to what's excluded and not.
Yes, I'll jump in quickly because that touches on the very long timeline and process that MDE has for developing regulatory programs. This recommendation suggests that in about 15 months from now, we would adopt a reporting rule, which would only begin the process of starting in 2026, collecting data that MDE doesn't currently have, which would need to be used to evaluate, baseline performance for parties that would be obligated under a cap and invest program, right? Like the significant sources of emissions in the state. The program itself would happen some years after that. So it's a very long timeline to develop this type of program before you have it fully enacted.
Hi, this is Jennifer.
Sorry, Jennifer, just adding one additional thought that I meant to get out there, which is that throughout that entire multi-year process, there'd be lots of opportunity for input on program design. Was that
Thanks.
Jennifer chiming in there? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm not there in person on the Zoom. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate these recommendations, and that I know the full commission would be very excited to see all three of these funding proposals in your recommendation so we can discuss them at the commission area. I want to thank Dana Stein for mentioning the 1% for public education, which is so very important. The question is, where would it come from? My suggestion is that it comes out of the part for subsidies for incentives, because if people don't know about the incentives, the only people who would take advantage of them are people who are already going to be going electric. So I hope that we will do the 1% and that we'll move ahead, and not only in Dana Stein's bill, but in all of them, that we would ask for 1% for public education. I'm not a member of this particular task force, so somebody else would have to make that amendment. So I wanted to encourage people to consider that. Thank you for this extraordinary work.
Thanks, Jennifer. Sonia.
Hi there. I think you answered part of my question, Mark. I was kind of wanting to chime in on what Garrett was saying with Cap and Invest, and kind of being largely supportive of the concept, but there's a ton of details to work through. And one of the questions I had was why it seemed like there's, and I'm not an expert, of course, but it seemed like there's a kind of a bottoms up or a top down approach to these programs, whether you choose to go with statewide emissions inventory or it's more of a sector specific emissions estimate. And I was just curious about the why Washington kind of rose to the top as the model that Maryland was suggesting we base our program off of.
I don't know that I have a great answer to that. I have colleagues in Washington that I talked with and worked with, so I became familiar with it. I think New York's got a really good model as well. So I want to emphasize the point that Mark made, is that the intention here is to authorize a cap and invest program. That's ultimately the recommendation here. And the allowing MDE to work with stakeholders to develop it, and it would be an economy-wide cap and invest program that's modeled off of the successful RGGI. But there's a lot of specifics that need to be worked out. And these three funding sources, the transport fee is probably the nearer term source of revenue, the cap and invest is the middle, and the renews the long term. But together, added up, that's a pretty strong package. So yeah, I just want to make that point.
Thanks. Going to Brian.
Hey, I have a comment and a question for Kathleen and for Kim. So the comment is that modeling the program on Washington doesn't necessarily translate into Washington level emissions allowance prices, right? So, I just want to be clear with that. So, we're concerned about impacts on ratepayers and on purchases of gasoline, that sort of thing, that we really need to work out a lot of things before we'd even be close to the level of pricing that we would see in Washington. I guess the question I have for Kathleen is, in the modeling, we probably do see some allowance price, results. So it'd be interesting to know what those look like, if they're available, or if they've been disclosed already. That's great. I guess I missed it. And then the question I had for Kim was, would the program, and if it's modeled on Washington, then I guess the answer is yes, but would the program subsume the power sector, i.e., would that mean that Maryland would exit RGGI? Or, this question is being dealt with in New York, as we speak, right? There's an administration sponsored cap and invest proposal and they're really wrestling with this question about whether or not to include the power sector. And it is possible actually to include the power sector and keep it in RGGI at the same time. I think there'd have to be some, sophisticated design elements included to allow that to work properly. But I'm just curious. I saw you, sort of shaking your head. So it sounds like we're not looking at exiting RGGI.
I am not suggesting that with this recommendation. This is an enabling recommendation for MDE to start moving in the direction of cap and invest, with lots of questions and details following. So, this isn't what what the role of this commission is to put forward recommendations that we make to the governor, the General Assembly, to mitigate climate change impacts. And the state has to generate revenue. So there's 3 programs that I'm suggesting allow for that goal to be met. It is not a bill language, you know, it's not regulatory language. All of that is yet to come. It's simply recommending that we move forward with it. But Brian, just to, and I am not suggesting that we get rid of Reggie or supplant this with Reggie with this.
Okay. I'm going to exercise facilitator privilege and call on my boss. Chris Hoagland, I see your hands up.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I would just say the way the department would approach the question of sectoral coverage, especially for the electricity sector, would be similar to how New York is considering it right now, where we already have a cap and invest program for electricity. So how would we build an economy-wide program around that? We have no interest from a policy perspective of exiting Reggie, and legally we can't exit Reggie, the department. We don't have that kind of discretion. And it's working very well, and it's an important partnership. So I think we would look to the New York model for how New York is considering how to build a program, a broader cap and invest program around Reggie. So that would also mean that when we're thinking about things like ratepayer impacts, there wouldn't necessarily be electricity ratepayer impacts from a cap and invest program because we already have Reggie covering the electricity sector. So just a couple thoughts on how the department would approach these questions if we were to, be implementing this recommendation.
Thanks, Chris. Next on the list is Bernie.
Thanks, Mark. I think Chris just tried to answer my question, but I'm a little bit confused. I know People's Council just came out with a report with the $250 electric bill increases coming next year. And there's discussion about the impact on gas prices. Are you saying that under this program, there would be no changes to electric prices?
I guess I'm saying that there's already a carbon price, there's already a cap and invest program for power plants through Reggie. So if this program were built to basically apply economy-wide cap and invest to all the other sectors, it wouldn't be applying anything new to the electricity sector. So when we're talking about for gasoline, when Dallas was giving us the rule of thumb about how if you add a carbon price to gasoline, because it takes 110 gallons of gasoline to emit 1 ton of CO2, you take, whatever your dollar per ton is, you divide it by 110, and that is what the per gallon carbon price would be for a gallon of gasoline. And assuming the oil companies pass on every single cent to customers, then that would be the gas price impact. If there's already a carbon price on electricity, and there has been for 15 years, it wouldn't be a new program on the electricity sector if we were just building an economy-wide program around the existing Reggie program. Does that make more sense?
Somewhat, but well, how about with natural gas then? Would it be the same for electricity produced by natural gas?
Yeah, so natural gas power plants in Maryland are already covered by Reggie.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Bernie and Chris. Going to Mike.
Yeah, a clarification, Kim, because I didn't focus on this, some of the text you had. Could you scroll up one level, Mark, the page? The opening sentence says to develop a program. The second sentence says implement. The bill that was introduced that Delegate Stein put in this last year, if you look at the fiscal note, they said that language was unclear, but they interpret it to mean that it was authorization to MDE to develop a program, but it wasn't an authorization to implement the program. So for a fiscal impact, they said this is the cost to develop the program. And I think the idea was all of these details that we're talking about would be worked out before the General Assembly voted on whether to implement. I'm willing to vote personally for the program if it's developed. If we're saying we're going to now recommend that General Assembly give the authority to implement before all of these details are worked out, I think that goes beyond what the bill last year does and beyond what I certainly understood we were discussing. And I didn't focus on that word implement until now.
So are you ask me your question again?
Yeah, if we went and if we basically, and maybe the only place it appears.
I mean, are you asking for all three of them simultaneously about
No,
it?
no, I'm only talking about the first one.
The cap and invest.
Yeah, and what I understood was that MD would take several years, 2 years at least, to develop this, and a lot of these details that we're raising questions about, including Reggie and so forth, which are MDE intent, but of course are not anywhere in here, would be developed by MDE over that time.
Right.
But the legislature would then, it would have to come back to the legislature to implement the cap and invest. That's what I think the House Bill 1272 did, and certainly it's what the fiscal note indicates they interpret it to be. And I think but your second paragraph used the word implement.
Right.
And I don't think I could support that now. We recommend that MDE grant them the authority to do it before we know the answers to all of these details.
Right. So my understanding, and I'll ask Chris and Mark to correct me where need be, but what we are talking about implementing a program. We're not talking about developing it. I mean, developing doesn't, frankly, I mean, it's a step, right? And we need to go much farther than a step. But it's a regulatory process. So as the MDE develops the regulations around a cap and invest program, as you are very familiar with, Mike, that's a long, cumbersome process where there's plenty of chances to intervene and have input. And so the recommendation is to develop and implement a revenue source, and cap and invest is the one we're putting forward. And the details of that will be worked out just like every other regulatory proposal that's put forward by the state. But let me turn it over to Mark and Chris in case I am not understanding the process correctly.
Yeah, that's right. For a regulation like this, it would be a long process to set all those requirements. And we would, under this proposal, we wouldn't be doing that full regulation next year, right? It would be a reporting rule next year, Kim. So next year for the bigger regulation would be stakeholdering, right? Lots of conversations about the nuts and bolts, what's coming now, for example.
But the key question is, do you view this recommendation as saying that you do not have to come back to the legislature for implementing legislation after you've developed it? Because that changes my vote. That's the reason I'm asking the question.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay.
The legislature, of course, has a role in the regulatory development process. So that would not be changed.
Thanks. Going back to Mark at OPC.
Thanks, Mark. I want to go back to the sectoral coverage question. I think it was Garrett who made the comment that we shouldn't foreclose what sectors might be included in the cap and invest program at this point. I agree with that. It was sort of why I asked the question about whether the cost effectiveness of emission reductions in some of the excluded sectors had been modeled. We think it should be, to the extent it can be. Obviously, there are economic sensitivities around aviation and shipping. We understand that, but there are also economic sensitivities with residential customers and other sectors. So we think that's important sort of bit of data to cover. My second comment is got I guess questions also for Kim. Kim, in developing the bullet list of where the proceeds will be invested, could you say a little bit more about how you decided on the percentages by category, the dollar amounts in the first two bullets, the 14,000 and 7,500, and then whether you considered, and if so, why you didn't include any sort of carbon dividends with the goal of keeping the lowest income households harmless from the increased price impacts of implementing the program. I think in the RFF report, and Dallas can confirm this, I know he's on the call, the determination or estimate was that you need 12 to 14% of proceeds used to as dividends to keep the lowest income quintile harmless, and in the range of 28-30% to expand that to the second lowest quintile. So would be interested in hearing your thoughts on the dividend question.
Yeah, thanks for those great questions, Mark. You can see there's a sentence in there that the General Assembly should direct revenues from the program toward the following strategic investments while applying a Justice 40 approach. So that was the catch-all, right? Rather than distinguishing a certain percentage, like as you're suggesting through a dividend, that 40% of the funds is directed at low income, under served overburdened communities. So if there's a better way to achieve that goal, I'm definitely happy and willing to consider it and look at it. And the bullets themselves are obviously the top contributors to greenhouse gas in Maryland. We've got the buildings, we've got transportation, infrastructure is a big one. So those top four bullets are what we've been talking about for years. So that's why those four were in there. I'll come back to the numbers themselves. The natural and working lands I'm particularly interested in this, given what the work that DNR is doing, the adaptation committee's working on a report. And I think that, you know, when you look at the equation, you got to look at both sides of it. So interested in supporting that. So those were the how those five got selected. The 7,500 for EVs is what is the federal government put out, and just matched it. It was what was in the report last year, if I'm not mistaken. Right, Mark? I think we recommended that as part of the EV recommendations from last year. And we had voted. Right.
I'd have to, I suppose, triple check, but essentially what we see here is aligned with what was published in the climate plan, which reflected the Climate Commission recommendations for EV incentives. There's more detail in the climate plan and the Climate Commission's recommendations around this, but in terms of the shorthand here, I think it's accurate, providing up to $7,500 per household. Note this would be state incentive, not federal incentive. For low, moderate, and middle income families. And then I think with the one above, the 14,000, in our climate plan, we said the state should continue the IRA funded home electrification rebate program once those federal funds run out. So, and again, recognizing this is a multi-year initiative before, you know, I think Kim's recommendation notes that revenue might not start flowing until 2028. So I think that we would see this as the potential funding to allow those electrification rebate programs, which, by the way, should be rolling out maybe in 2025 here. Well, yay, Maryland, to keep that program running. That's what we said in the climate plan.
Right. And thank you, Mark. And if I'm remembering this correctly, last year the recommendation from the commission mimicked what we have here and what was in the plan, at least in concept, if not in numbers.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And just to be clear, I wasn't questioning the sort of the content of the bullets in terms of energy efficiency EVs. I was just asking about the percentages assigned to each of those categories, and sounds like those are the four major categories. So we're just going to allocate. Okay, that makes sense. I do think the dividend question deserves a little bit more, and appreciate the Justice 40, but I don't know that that will get us all the way we need to get in terms of mitigating the impact. So
Okay.
we would want to discuss that more.
All right, thank you. Happy to.
Thanks. Tom.
Sorry, Lewis dropped out, I guess. So in terms of market coverage, if power plants are going to stay in RGGI, that's about, in terms of the large emitters, that's about 60% of the potential coverage. Another big chunk, or relatively big chunk, is cement. And then you've got other smaller fractions of the pie, like landfills, which you have separate regulations for. I'm wondering about, what the policy design looks like that deals with the overlap in regulatory issues. For example, building owners and occupants paying $230 a ton for emissions versus something else that's in a RGGI market, but also the different trajectory. The RGGI trajectory is around 2% of the allowances come out of the market every year. Correct me if I'm wrong. Washington State was pulling 7% out per year, and their near-term target's not as steep a reduction as ours is. So I'm not sure who to direct the question to, but kind of in terms of how this would operate and how you maintain equity and consistency. I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts on how to reconcile those questions.
I can take one stab in the abstract. We sort of refer to that challenge as complementary policies in the RGGI context, where, for example, RGGI isn't the only program that affects power plant emissions, right? The Renewable Portfolio Standard does, the Empower program does. And so when you have different programs that come at a sector from different directions, whether it's, a carbon regulation pushing down pollution, while an RPS is building up clean energy, right? The idea is you want to account for those interactions when you're setting the policy. And generally the outcome is that a carbon cap or cap and invest program is would automatically adjust to the others. To the extent other programs are making progress, then basically there's less work that needs to be done by the carbon cap. So it's cheaper. That's sort of how that ends up in the end. But it's absolutely something that you'd want to, in setting the parameters for a carbon cap and invest program, like we do when we recalibrate the RGGI cap with the other RGGI program, we want to account first for what all of the other programs are going to achieve. And so then we can see how the carbon regulation would work given what all of those other relevant programs are doing. So I guess I don't have an answer to what the design question would be, but that's how it would be approached, is that you account for everything else when you're sort of setting the cap and the other parameters of the cap and invest program. And since that's a market-based program, one of its advantages is that it's flexible and it'll find the lowest cost solution. And if things become less expensive because another program is doing part of the job, then the program should automatically account for that, in theory.
Right. So the MEA study in 2022 looked at a number of scenarios. One of them was an $80 a ton fee, which in the tables that accompanied the report showed it contributed to a 40% reduction. Has anybody done any math or thought about what the kind of the price ceiling would have to be? And related to that is kind of the near-term targets. If this is it takes 3 years to get organized and implemented, how much reduction is going to be available for the 2031 target date?
Yeah, those are analytical questions. I guess there would need to be time and implementation to explore them. I think New York is a good example there. How they've been structuring their analysis as they set the parameters for their program, including their price controls, where they have proposed elements to set price caps and whatnot. But those are analytical questions that would have to be answered through analysis in program development. I don't think we have the answers before embarking on that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I've got 3 more hands up, so we'll go there. I guess attempting to capture some notes here and recap, there's some conversation around what specifically would be authorized by this recommendation, with some departing views on what you all intend to do with this recommendation. And then, as Mark was just talking about, wanting to discuss more specificity around the refunds or incentives for low-income households. I'm taking these notes because we assumed coming into this meeting that we'd have some discussion around the recommendations, and that there might be some effort in the coming weeks as we head towards September 18th to work in the background to flesh out potential amendments for the working group to consider, so that we could come into the September 18th meeting with some perhaps final draft recommendations. All right, let's see. And that said, if we're able to discuss any of the other recommendations that came introduced, be the fossil fuel transport fee mitigation fund and Renew Act today, that could be helpful just to kind of get a gauge of the room on that. But going to Beth. Oh, Beth, did we just lose you?
Are we there?
Yeah, we hear you now.
Okay. So I appreciate the discussion. Like my colleague Jennifer Mizrahi, I'm not a mitigation working group member, but as a commission member, I too want to express my support for these proposals that Kim has laid out here. And I would hope that at September 18th, there would be recommendations for revenue generation that would come forward to the full commission. So appreciate the discussion. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And noted. Ian.
Thanks, Mark. I just want to note that final bullet, program administration, 5%. I don't think that's going to be sufficient to run any of these programs. Just for context, it's a little all over the place, but we're trying to standardize the CEF at 10%. That's what the Brighter Tomorrow Act did. The federal programs, in some cases, authorize much higher amounts, as much as 20%. And I could give other examples of other programs that have higher percents. So I would definitely look to increase that at least to 10% in order to hire staff to review grants and develop programs and do the financial work as well on the back end. So I just want to make that note.
Okay, thanks. Lewis.
Thanks, Mark. So really for Kim, I guess, and following up from Mark from OPC's question, Kim, I guess, one, in developing the bullet points on where the money should be spent and the percentages that you arrived at, one, did you look at those allocations in making your second set of recommendations for, I guess, what is Part B on the fossil fuel transport fee in determining those percentages? And then two, I guess, since it's expected to be enabling, do we want to be so prescriptive in the recommendation to be so specific about where those monies we feel they should go?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. It actually, Delegate Stein and I guess me, but Delegate Stein developed the percentage allocations. We worked together on that. And we did not try to mimic what was in the cap and invest. It was obviously there's a lot of overlap, but the numbers were independent. So for example, the asthma treatment was added in there and mass transit was specifically called out. So, but your question about how prescriptive to be on this, I think is a good point. And maybe as we look to clarify language around implementation, maybe we can look at how to adjust the specificity that we're providing in this recommendation. Happy to work with you on that.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bob?
It's on Bob Wright, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, okay. So this is a question on the transport fee in Part B. I noticed your example was train, and I assume that's the largest amount that would go through, but obviously coal is sometimes hauled by truck. And so is that included or excluded? And it's the same with natural gas. Is it only natural gas through pipelines?
My understanding is that it's all sources.
All sources. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Railroad and pipeline companies. Is Delegate Stein still on?
Yes, I mean that's my intention.
Right.
Yeah.
Mark, are we talking about B and C, or are we still only on A, or just want to clarify for people wanting to comment?
Yeah, we're going wherever you all want to go on 1A, B, or C. We've got about 40 minutes left in today's meeting.
I'll add my hand to the list then for B and C.
Well, then you're next up, Mike. Go ahead.
On B, I mean, it's already been referenced to, we're going to see electric utility rates raise considerably, right? I mean, it's a 24% increase from the capacity charge alone. You'll have to add to that another 200 some million dollars a year for the must run for Brandon Shores, plus the 800 million for the new transmission line to replace Brandon Shores. So electric rates are going to raise high. We already knew natural gas rates were going to go high. And I'm concerned about anything that would raise utility rates. My understanding of the fiscal note is that the natural gas portion of this is what causes most of the increase. I know Columbia Gas has told me they estimate about $250,000 for residential customers in their territory alone. I don't have numbers for the other gas utilities, but it probably that or higher. But on the other hand, the fiscal impact of the coal is relatively low. Though Brandon Shores burns coal, most of the coal going through the state is exported, and therefore a fossil fuel fee on the coal portion has much less impact on Maryland ratepayers. So though I could vote in favor of a fossil fuel transport fee on coal, I don't think I can support natural gas at this point in time. On the Renew Act, if we're going to comment on all of them, the fiscal note, I think, indicates that we really wouldn't collect anything during the effective period, which I think means through 2030, and would cost the state about $2 million a year in between now and then. So it is actually a cost loser for the next at least 4 or 5 years. And given the fiscal needs of the state and our need to raise funds for climate, I think that's counterproductive. And I never liked the idea of sort of trying to punish somebody in retroactively for something that they were permitted or maybe even encouraged to do in the past. So I don't really favor C. For B, my own position is I think I would favor something that was limited to coal, but I am concerned about, at least for the next few years while we got this electric rate hike, doing something that impacts gas.
Okay, thank you. Kathleen?
Yes, just wanted to follow up briefly on some of the conversation about the funding distribution between A and B. I think it's great that in the part B, there is that specific call out to mass transit, just because I'm very mindful of how important VMT reductions were in our modeling for the plan. And I note in the Cap and Invest in A, transit is included in infrastructure, but the infrastructure is doing a lot of heavy lifting across many different sectors there. And not being sure, which one of these or both might go forward. I'm wondering if transit might get a little bit more prominence in Part A to help make sure that that gets support if the second recommendation doesn't actually get adopted. Perhaps, adding it to some of the electric vehicles bucket or something like that.
Got it. Okay, I've added that to the notes. Tom?
Thanks, Mark. Kim, when you're looking at the distribution of proceeds, you might give some thought to what to do about natural and working lands, at least in the near term, because that would be spending a considerable amount of the proceeds on a category that doesn't count towards 2031. We're not going to, if we're doing things on a gross emissions basis, what does that do to our chances of hitting the number? It's just something to keep in mind for thought.
Well, thank you, Tom, because I think that's the Pandora's box right there, and if, what are we aiming for as the mitigation work group? And Mike and I have had many conversations about, our job is not ratepayers. It's not electric rates. It is emission reductions. And the recommendations that there's just no way to get to the goal, if we can even get to the goal, without revenue. And, the working lands is driven to the 2045 goal. So do we start using that as the end point, or are we really trying to get to the 2031 goal? And if we are trying to get to 2031, then we have to accelerate. We can't think and design and develop with no intent of implementing that. It's just not enough time. So I feel like there's a pretty sobering conversation around really what are we trying to do here? And I can answer for myself, but as the mitigation work group, I don't know that there's clarity on that.
Agreed.
Ian?
Just in reaction to that last point, I think we know that the biggest reductions the soonest are the most important and have the biggest impact. Obviously, efficiency matters too. But whether we're thinking about 2031 or 2045, the sooner we get those reductions, the benefits will continue to compound. And so I think that is a lens that I would advocate for as we think about how to invest any proceeds should a revenue package come together for any of these.
Alrighty, so I see that maybe some discussion is starting to settle down on recommendation 1, which of course was a loaded one with parts A, B, and C. We do have a guest here to provide some commentary on recommendation 2. So I wonder if at this point, in order to kind of get to some initial discussion on some of these draft recommendations, if we can move on to 2. This one also came in Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's a good idea. I would just add that we might want to ask people if they have amendments they want to propose. It might be useful to have them submitted in advance of the next meeting so people can look at them rather than have them come out for the first time at the next meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to touch base with you and Kim about that to establish kind of a deadline and a process. So I guess early note for the members, if the co-chairs agree, I'll follow up with some information about just to kind of establish a deadline and a process for submitting suggested amendments for all these all four recommendations here. Kim, do you want to intro number 2? And then I'm happy to say that we were able to convince Brian Jenkins from the Building Decarb Coalition, who has some expertise on AC to heat pumped policies, to share a perspective on this one.
Sorry, I'm trying to get things lined up. Yes, happy to. So, I mean, this is pretty straightforward. It's to facilitate the transition from air conditioners, one-way air conditioners, to two-way heat pumps, which are far more energy efficient and also will help us meet emission reductions and help the consumer out. So I think this recommendation hits at a number of priorities for us, and maybe I'll just yield time to Brian, and then we can have a little bit further discussion about it.
Okay, thanks. Brian, I think I saw that you're online. So do you want to take a few minutes and share the Building Decarb Coalition's perspective on these policies?
Yes, I actually do have a slideshow, if that's okay.
Sure thing. And also, if you would send the slides to me afterwards, I can post them.
Sounds great. We up and rolling? Yes.
Yep, we see it.
Thank you all for your time. Sorry about that.
Yeah, there we go. We see slide 2. There you go. Title slide.
Thank you. Yes, today I'll talk about why heat pumps and building decarbonization matter, how AC to heat pumps work, and what it could mean for Maryland, and how we are working to get the market and supply chain ready for a smooth and equitable transition. In Maryland, buildings are directly emitting 11 million metric tons of greenhouse gases per year, or 13% nationwide emissions. Building decarbonization will create job opportunities in the growing heat pump market. Maryland is already a leader in the heat pump adoption, with 54% of homes on track to adopt by 2030. Statewide, eliminating fossil fuel equipment would remove nearly as much nitrogen oxide emissions as taking half the state's diesel vehicles off the road. And then Black residents are exposed to about 70% more pollution from residential gas equipment, such as gas furnaces and gas water heaters. And low-income neighborhoods and communities of color in Maryland face disproportionately higher rates of exposure to pollution for homes and buildings, which undermines overall health and well-being. What is a heat pump? I have actually recently attended MACO, which was a fantastic experience. I got to spend time with some of the people on this call. There was some confusion about exactly what heat pumps are, so I thought I would talk about what is a heat pump. Heat pumps are highly efficient electric appliances that both heat and cool homes. There are also heat pump water heaters and dryers, but we're focusing on the opportunity of heat pumps as space heaters. They also can work in cold climates down to sub-zero temperatures with the advancement in technology. Maryland residents upgrading to a heat pump for space heating and cooling could save hundreds, if not thousands of dollars per year. And this all comes from a RMI research, which is linked in the slideshow that I'd be happy to share a link as well afterwards. Let's talk about some grid resilience. Converting central AC to heat pumps will increase grid demand and help alleviate stress on the grid. They are far more efficient than gas appliances. They're going to save the consumer money, no matter what the grid mix may be moving forward as we adjust to this new energy transition. Heat pumps adoption in Maryland as a whole. Heat pumps are not new in Maryland. This is a technology that already exists and it's growing in popularity. Maryland is adopting heat pumps at a higher rate than other states in the Mid-Atlantic region, over 20%, or just under 500,000 of homes in Maryland had a heat pump in 2020. You can see in this slide that heat pumps are already outselling ACs and furnaces in the state and have been for some time. So just to discuss what an actual AC to heat pump policy is. An AC to heat pump policy will encourage consumers who are replacing or buying a new air conditioning system to choose a heat pump instead of a traditional one-way AC system. It does not prevent consumers from purchasing a gas furnace or require them to replace an existing gas furnace. But ultimately, the goal here needs to be moving towards full adoption. Tapping into consumer demand for the central AC units as an entry point for heat pump adoption and acceleration in coming years could provide a key policy tool to help decarbonize a substantial number of homes. This can also help bolster the heat pump marketplace by sending a signal across the supply chain that the state is committed to the transition, which along with the zero heat emission standards, Maryland is already developing. And I think just to reiterate, it will also increase, heat pump adoption as a whole across the state. It will help. It also helps protect consumers from purchasing a new AC unit that may no longer be the right piece of equipment for their needs in a few years. So now let's talk about AC to heat pump benefits in Maryland. At the current pace, around 44% of HVAC installations in Maryland will be heat pumps by 2030. You can see in the figure. This is a significant increase in heat pump adoption, but not quite where Maryland will need to be in 2030 to meet its climate targets. With a policy change that requires AC heat pump installations, state can increase adoption rate to over 70% by 2030. And this figure only highlights residential, but greater impacts can be seen if commercial is also included at some point in the future. This is an example of a current policy making its way through the California process, but Colorado legislature is also exploring the idea, and NESCOM is also exploring the policy framework as well. So Maryland is not alone in exploring an AC to heat pump policy and what it can mean and the benefits it can bring. And of course, the big question is the market ready and how do we bring down the cost? To answer both, we need to engage the supply chain actors. I did see a few of them on the call today, manufacturers to distributors and contractors, the people who are going to make this transition possible to be brought to speed and included in the development. We have been facilitating this conversation with our coalition partners for the past several years. And this year we formalized that conversation with a number of our manufacturing and distributing partners into the commitment we call a joint vision for a decarbonized future, which the link is also in the slideshow, but happy to provide as well in the chat in a few minutes. You can view the entire document on our website. And these are the signatories of the joint vision statement. These 11 signatories of the joint vision include major HVAC and water heating manufacturers, like Ferguson, the largest distributor of these products in the country. Altogether, they represent about 75% of the market, and they are committed to distributing heat pumps to the nation. We feel that this is so important because for the first time, a large group of companies affirm their commitment to a decarbonized future. They are telling legislators they are on board and they want to be a part of the transition. Can the market be ready? Can we bring down costs? And I believe the answer is yes, by working together. These are key to making sure that the supply chain is ready. These are the things that are going to make the transition smoother, more equitable, and more affordable. Consumer education campaigns, expanding workforce development programs, and funding for electrical service upgrades to get homes ready. And my name is, of course, Brian Jenkins. I'm the Mid-Atlantic Senior Regional Manager for the Building Decarbonization Coalition. I will do my best to answer your questions. And if I can't, we certainly have a team that can. My email is also included here if you would like to reach out after today, because I know we are running a little low on time.
Thank you, Brian. Great overview. I see some questions from Kim and Mike and others. So Kim.
Brian, thank you very much. It was a great overview and thought you raised some really important points. I wanted to give you the chance to respond to the concern that Kyle raised earlier in the meeting about getting the consumer to sign an affidavit. And if you felt that that was an important step that needs to be done. Have you seen that elsewhere?
I have not seen that elsewhere. But I would be happy to take that question back to the team to see if they've seen that in other states as well, or what kind of pushback they've also received.
Great. I'll connect with you. Thank you.
Mike?
That actually fits with mine. I don't really have a problem with the idea of asking contractors to talk about the availability of the heat pumps, maybe even just give an estimate. But that extra requiring to have an affidavit that the customer signs and all of that burden on local businesses, I couldn't support that portion of the recommendation, because that seems to be way overkill. I'm certainly not aware of any requirement we have elsewhere where we ask, and I'm not talking about just in climate change, where we're asking customers to sign affidavits from contractors before they have to do something. So I that part of it I think is overkill.
Thanks. And actually, I'll keep on going through. If Brian, you're able to, you mentioned that California and Colorado are, I guess they have legislation or regulatory actions trying to drive ACT pump policies. If there's time and if you're able to say kind of how they're doing this, if it's different from this approach, that would be great. But I'll just plant that seed while we go to Garrett.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I had a similar reaction. I mean, I very much applaud the intent. I think we all know that it's for probably, I assume, the majority, maybe the vast majority of replacement of AC units. Most folks are trusting the contractors who come to know what they're talking about as a technical issue. It's clear that if the contractors are not offering heat pumps as an option, and in fact encouraging folks to consider that option, we're going to see very, very little adoption of this. And so I very much applaud the intent of this to make sure that heat pumps are being put on the table by the contractor as an option. I wanted to ask as well if anyone's doing this, because it does feel to me like it's not sure how we enforce this. Or if I feel like if there is no intent to enforce it, contractors will just make a snide comment about this, have the person sign something, it goes in. I'm not sure it actually causes a meaningful heat pump option to be put on the table. And I would personally much prefer a version of this where we say, let's stop spending public money on incentivizing AC only units, as well as incentivizing fossil fuel only heating units. Wherever we're going to spend public money, such as through the Empower Maryland program, let's spend it on heat pumps that do both. Let's make sure that people understand the benefits of this. Let's make it more likely that contractors will have an incentive to encourage someone to do heat pumps. But the idea here so I have a question for the sponsor of this recommendation. Like, have we entertained actually putting a recommendation forward to the commission that says, let's stop subsidizing AC only units. Let's talk about where the money goes on this, which we can do without requiring new money out of the state budget. We're just talking about, hey, Empower Maryland, let's stop giving out public money in the form of subsidies to AC only units or to fossil fuel only units. Like, would we consider that? But then, and then my question about the proposal that was actually here is, do we think it actually would work, and how would we enforce this notion of just information being provided? Is this going to move the needle enough that it's worth the squeeze of trying to implement this? As much as I love heat pumps, I'm not convinced that it will.
I don't know if that was directed at me, but I'll take it. You're absolutely right. The intent of the affidavit was to ensure that information is getting transferred, right? That they understand the pluses, the minuses, and everything else. Otherwise, we're going to create a program and it's not going to work. Now, maybe that is overkill, and so I'm completely wide open to other mechanisms to achieve that result. What we want is more heat pumps, right? That's it. And we know public education is critical, especially from contractors, for that to occur. So how do we make that happen? So I wrote it down here about the stop the incentivizing of the one ways and ACs, and yeah, happy to chat on that, Garrett.
Mark?
Thanks, Mark. I also really appreciate this suggestion at a high level. I think that ensuring that HVAC contractors are providing customers with a full range of their options and good information is critical. And it's not happening now. We know that from talking with residential customers. I know it from personal experience. I won't go into it in detail, but I've talked in the last couple of weeks because we have an old AC mini split unit. One of the recent storms blew out a circuit board. We want to replace it with a heat pump. I've had two separate HVAC contractors in Baltimore City just poo-poo heat pumps, either misrepresent or just not understand the functionalities of modern heat pumps. So I think this is a serious, serious problem. I'm not sure the particular prescriptions with the affidavit are the right way to. One thing might be to look at the current law that governs the HVAC contractors. I could put in the chat both the statute and the regulations. There's a board of heating, ventilation, and air conditioning contractors that is established under the Department of Labor that determines the examinations contractors have to take, continuing education, or whether they need continuing education. I think there's a lot that could be done within sort of the existing legal structures to improve the performance of building contractors providing HVAC services. So I think this definitely deserves more attention. I really appreciate the suggestion of bringing it to the attention of the working group. And again, I'll put in the chat these legal references so people can sort of see what the existing legal oversight structure is. Thanks.
Good, thank you. Bob Wright?
Yes, thank you. In part of the education to the consumer, and if one came to my house, in addition to the advantages of a heat pump, one of the questions I would have, because there are other electrical appliances that I might want to switch from gas, is I need to run wiring, and what cost might that be? And is the service to my house, which is 200 amps, and I'm sure many people have 200 amps. So if I were switching to heating with electric, switching to hot water with electric, switching to 2-car charging, switching to an electric dryer, and doing my cooking, am I going to incur an additional cost to either increase the amp of my service? And I will know, depending on where they place the appliance, that I will have to do wiring. And no one seems to want to talk about that, but it could be a significant additional cost for a switch. And I'm just wondering, where in the program are we talking about letting the customer know what he might have to do. All right. Thank you.
It's a good point, Bob. And I guess that could be an area for clarification. If this recommendation continued on the kind of current trajectory of suggesting that there be a consumer education obligation, then that additional context of potential heavy up costs could be included. But it sounds like there's some question as to whether or not the, consumer education and a statement to the effect that the consumer receive that education, if that's even the appropriate approach here. And perhaps on that note, Sonia from BGE.
Yeah, and I think I'll agree with a lot of the comments in that I very much appreciate the spirit of this. We need a lot of heat pumps, and all of our research has suggested that the market isn't there. I think there's a lot to learn from the way EV adoption has rolled out on this one, right? You have your OEMs that required a ZEV target to really get going. We have a lack of incentivized salespeople and dealers, right? Which is similar to what you may face with local contractors. And then you have consumer education. And I wonder if there would be a way to come up with, at least as a starting point or an alternative on solutioning a little bit, something more like the manufacturer, the OEM goals that we have for EVs. If we have this collection of a dozen or so manufacturers that are on board with heat pumps and want to be first to market, could we somehow leverage that, right, to give them a target to hit as a minimum sales and then start to push that from the top down, while in parallel we create some consumer education programs. And also I wanted to mention, if it's helpful, BGE just filed some significant electrification incentives that are with the PSC right now. And Kim, if you haven't seen those, if you want to, or if you'd like to connect with the team that did the research on kind of why we suggested what we did, we'd be happy to facilitate that.
Thank you. And let's see, I'll go to Kathleen next. If our caller Kyle from Carrier is on, I'd invite you as a manufacturer to this conversation as well. Kathleen.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to add some thoughts on the consumer education piece that we've been talking a lot about. One sort of very simple addition to this could be the state could publish like a county by county one-pager on all of the incentives from federal, state, and local level that are available for heat pumps, and just be able to give that to a contractor and say, you have to hand this to every customer. So, they are aware of how much money's on the table to help with that adoption. And that alone could potentially drive more interest. Also wanted to mention, in response to the comment about the wiring upgrades and such that are needed, that's definitely a concern, but the federal incentives through the IRA do account for that. So you can pay for instance, panel upgrades using the IRA incentives as well. So that could be part of the consumer education.
Thanks. Capture that in my notes, I think. Tom.
Thanks, Mark. It's an interesting topic. I sat in a seminar at an ASHRAE conference about the ethical responsibilities of mechanical engineers advising their clients. And it's, bigger scale, but it goes down to this same problem, is that pieces of equipment and reach the end of their useful life at different times, right? So maybe the issue to jump here is more towards the incentive side, which is making sure that the customer understands that there are incentive programs to relieve them of the stranded cost, right? So the AC goes first, the furnace still has life, and there's a program that's specifically targeted at helping with the kinds of costs that Bob Wright mentioned, but also incentivizing them to do an earlier replacement of the heating system. And not that it's particularly important to the conversation at this point, but I think in the past I'm not a big fan of the upstream incentives. I think it creates conflicts of interest, and we've avoided that in car sales and environment, I think last year. So more education and more ethical responsibility to completely explain the options and the incentives might be a good way to address this.
Thanks, Tom. Ian?
So I mean, I think we're a lot of, I don't hear a lot of dissent. I mean, a lot of these conversations and suggestions are not mutually exclusive or contradictory. So I think that we might be making some progress on this one. I would just say, there's a bit of a truism that we not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So, maybe the enforcement, if we take out some of the more prescriptive requirements in this recommendation, won't be all that robust, but it still might make a difference in some cases, right? That, contractors may ask questions, hey, I'm handing this out. What is this? I should look into it. Consumers who get it, same thing. I think that you add on, a lot of the incentives that exist, and the federal rebates. There's also federal funds available for contractor training. There's a TREC, sometimes known as a TREC program that DOE has. So I think it's going to be a bunch of different things put together. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't good aspects of this recommendation that could be advanced. Maybe we do have to go through the the regulatory body at labor that regulates these contractors, HVAC contractors. But I think we're sort of moving in a similar direction, and I think we should try to capture that and come up with what may be a consensus or close to a consensus maybe before the next meeting. It sounds like there's a lot of commonality there.
And then Mark, I'm still on. Just quickly, I think a lot of these alternatives and ideas that were thrown out merit us going back and having some further conversations. I think they're all probably more productive than what's in the current recommendation with the affidavit. Just quickly on the incentive, what we have learned is that the closer we get an incentive to that kitchen table decision, the better in our channel. So I think it was Tom that mentioned upstream is problematic in many ways. What we have seen is that it's true. If it goes to the OEM, it's just too far removed from the decision that's happening at the kitchen table, where the dealer needs to present all of the options, including the heat pump, and the consumer needs to make the decision. And I'd be happy to work with those interested to explore some of these alternatives. I think Brian's a perfect person to convene kind of a broader OEM conversation.
Thank you. Any other comments on recommendation 2? Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, reminding everybody of the recent executive order that directs every executive state agency to develop a climate implementation plan. I think it's November 1st of this year is the due date. And I think on this particular issue, labor could actually do a lot through this board of HVAC contractors without the need for additional legislation or regulation. So that might be something to look into for sure, because I think, yeah, I agree with Ian. There seems to be general consensus on the need for us to do something here. Clearly, the sort of education and information that should be being provided isn't, and I think there are a number of ways to do that, and I think we've done a good job sort of honing in on them today.
Okay, thanks. So clearly some opportunities for some amendments to this one. Again, there'll be a follow-up email for me after I talk with the co-chairs on the process and timeline there. We've got just 6 minutes left. Maybe Kim, your call. Do you want to introduce 3 just to get the introduction done? And then we'll pretty much be at the end of the meeting at that point.
Oh, wait. Yeah, that'd be great. So this is a straightforward one, but follows on the conversation we just had. Reggie continues to bring in lots of money. As I said earlier, 214 million this year, 140 last year, which is $74 million increase in 1 year. And my suggestion is that we create basically a new fund at DHCD, Department of Housing Community Development, for $10 million of the RGGI. So we take 10 million of RGGI and give it to DHCD to replace old heating and cooling systems with heat pumps, replace old water heaters with heat pump water heaters, and hang on, did this get edited? Yeah, so this would be focused on limited income families. So I should have put that in the bottom part there. So they started helping more limited income. There it is. So that's the recommendation that we can, and I think it might fold in nicely with the conversation we just had, because we can start implementing heat pumps using $10 million from RGGI for low or limited income families, households, and that helps get that market moving in Maryland. So that's the recommendation.
I suppose we can use our last 4 minutes of the meeting for any initial discussion on this one.
Well, I just want to real quickly surprise Kim by saying I support this one. Because we're talking about huge increases in electric rates, and they're obviously going to affect low-income housing the most. I mean, the capacity alone is going to be 24% increase in electric rates. By the time we're finished, it won't surprise me. It's a 50% increase in electric rates over between 2025 and 2028. So I do think designating some RGGI funds to this purpose is a good idea.
Thanks, Mike. Any other commentary on this one, Garrett?
I'm just curious, Kim, if what's DHCD's input been on doing this? I know they're scaling up a lot to take on these larger goals under Empower. As long as we feel confident we're going to be able to use these funds, I think this is a great use of this kind of funds. Would be very supportive.
Yeah, and Ian can speak to this as well, but they're on board.
Right. I think they've said that they do see this need. Let me just, as a final comment, mention this is one way of doing this. Another way to accomplish this might be to add to the authorized uses of the CEF, which is, of course, the fund that includes RGGI that MEA uses to fund our programs. Add an authorized use of electrification, and and then that would allow MEA to transfer this funds direct over to DHCD for this program or for another program that's similar without being quite as specific. So it's just something to think about. I know we're out of time, so I'll just leave it there, and we could take other conversation either offline or to the next meeting.
Ian, I got a quick, so that wouldn't require legislation?
No, I think it would. I think it would.
Okay.
Yeah. We can chat about that.
Yeah, I think either way, whether it's directing funding or giving more flexibility to CEF would be legislative. All right, well, 2 minutes left. Any additional conversation on recommendation 3? Seth?
Yeah, I might just add that, RGGI funds do pay for bill pay assistance for low-income customers, and that's something that every year, year in, year out, we're using those state funds to pay. And, a lot of customers don't have alternative. They don't have the income to pay those bills. And so helping electrification, helping with conversions, helping reduce energy burdens can also take pressure off those RGGI funds for that year in, year out, payment that they're making for utility bill pay.
Thanks. And Nicola?
And then I would add that this could also take some pressure off of the Empower program as well. And Garrett, to the question of how that works in a scale. So as you know, our programs currently have a cap, a project cost cap, and oftentimes it is not possible to do all of the installation and air sealing work and the system upgrades under that cap. So this could, help with leveraging other funds for the heating system portion.
Yeah, very enabling us to spend this money very cost effectively, going deeper with savings without having to spend extra work identifying additional customers and all that. This is a great idea.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for the conversation. We're at 3. Kim, Mike, any concluding comments you'd like to make?
No,
Go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say we'll provide people by email a note on when we'd like to get amendments if anybody has them submitted and distributed.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for a great discussion, and kind of circling back too. I think it's worked well to have fewer but more substantial recommendations and discussions around it. So I think that we might have hit the sweet spot this year. And Mark and Mike, can you stay on for 5 minutes?
Sure.
Okay, great.
Sure, can do. Thanks, everyone. That's a wrap. And we invite you to depart so that I can chat with the co-chairs.
Thank you.
See y'all.
Mark, should I end the meeting recording now or keep that on until you're finished with the co-chairs?
We can end. Thanks.